Hey, I'm Brooks with BrooksBrownCoaching.com, and in this video I'm going to discuss how your stress and cortisol levels can affect things like weight gain, muscle loss, testosterone levels, as well as some general health effects it can have. I'll talk about things that might increase your stress and cortisol levels, and then maybe some things you can do to lower it. So I want to start off by explaining what cortisol is and kind of where it comes from and some of the things that it does. So cortisol is a steroid hormone. It is a glucocorticosteroid, meaning it's not a sex hormone. It is a hormone that's produced in a place other than somewhere like the testicles or the ovaries, which is a lot of the hormones that we've talked about in the past, like testosterone and estrogen. Cortisol is actually produced in the adrenal glands, which are little glands that sit on top of your kidneys. Now, I'm not going to get super deep into the chemistry and the biology of how all this stuff is created, but I just kind of want to go through it like real high level. So the way that this is created in your body is initially there is a perceived threat. Now, evolutionarily, this would have been something like, the saber-toothed tiger has just walked into the camp and you all of a sudden have this perceived threat. You see this thing and you realize you have either got to fight or run. So when you see that threat, that message goes in your brain into a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary gland, which tells your pituitary gland to make a certain chemical that starts to circulate in your blood that is then picked up by those adrenal glands and starts to create this cortisol. All right. So that is actually, if you get into it, is a very complex process, but all we need to know is threat into the brain, down to the adrenal glands. Now we've got this cortisol going. So that response was initially, like I said, created for you to either prepare to run or fight. And one of the things that we really need to have working well for us, if we're going to have to fight or run, is our decision-making ability, meaning our brain. So that cortisol is going to circulate through your body to your entire body, but it's going to be picked up specifically by a few organs, and it's going to start having an effect on them. So one of the first things that we're going to see is it's going to go to your liver. This cortisol is going to enter your liver, and your liver is going to start doing its best to produce sugar. And it's trying to produce this sugar because, like I said, we need those decision-making abilities to be really good. We need to be able to make good decisions quickly because we are in this threat, this acute threat state. Your brain really prefers to use sugar to make decisions. And your body is aware of this. So in this situation, your body is going to try to produce a bunch of sugar. So the way it's going to do that is, again, when that cortisol hits your liver, you're going to go through a process called gluconeogenesis, which is creation of blood sugar through a few different processes, and then glycogenolysis, which is breaking down stored sugar. So that's increasing your blood glucose levels to prepare for whatever this is about to happen, to prepare your brain to start making these decisions really quickly. And then it's going to start to limit the use of blood glucose everywhere else in the body because it's trying to reserve that fuel for the brain. So when it goes to your muscles, it's going to tell them to start preferring to use fatty acids as fuel. Stop using up the sugar, try to use fatty acids. Additionally, we want to conserve energy everywhere else, like I said, except the brain. So we're going to that cortisol is going to start turning off processes that are really energy intensive. And a very energy intensive process is protein synthesis. So that is, we think of using protein to start creating muscle fibers, start building muscles. It's going to try to turn that off. Additionally, it's going to start breaking down the muscle tissue that's there to turn that into amino acids that can circulate to then be used in that gluconeogenesis process to create blood sugar and to create some fuel for other organs since they're not really using glucose anymore. They're now starting to use fatty acids and they're starting to use amino acids because we're trying to preserve that blood sugar for the brain to make those quick decisions to get us out of this perceived dangerous scenario. So that's why we can think of cortisol as a catabolic hormone, meaning that it is breaking down rather than building. If you think of testosterone or insulin, for instance, those are storage and really anabolic hormones. So we think of testosterone or insulin in the muscles. It's the exact opposite, right? It's going to start to increase protein synthesis. It's going to start assimilating amino acids, not breaking them down. It's going to start storing blood glucose rather than secreting it into the blood. So those hormones, testosterone and insulin, are really anabolic, and then cortisol is kind of the opposite. So it's starting to break down. So once that happens, now we're in this state where we can start making these decisions quickly. Our muscles are running off of this fat. And some of this sounds good. And it is if we are in genuinely a fight or flight scenario. Problems start to arise when this situation goes on for too long. So, typically a fight or flight scenario would be, just like I said, there's this perceived threat and we either fight our way through it, we escape, or you die. All of that can happen typically pretty quickly. And, that's kind of relative. Maybe it's 30 seconds. You pick up the spear, you throw it and kill the saber-toothed tiger, or you run and you're able to get away, or it eats you. But all of that could probably happen, I don't know, it could happen in 30 seconds. It could happen in 10 minutes, maybe an hour, I don't know, but not days, not weeks. That isn't going to go on. And that's where a lot of us are now. We're in this state for days, weeks, months, perpetually. You've been in it so long you don't even realize it anymore. And so I'm going to talk to you about what that can do. So let's say we're in that state where we've kept those levels really high. We're keeping that blood sugar really high. Just on that standpoint, you're keeping that blood sugar really high for a long time because you're facing other stressors. It's not the predator. It is work. It is a relation. It's your marriage. It's your significant other. It's a friendship. It is some sort of dissatisfaction with your life right now. Those are just, environmental things that could be going on. Additionally, it can be your diet. And I'll get more into specifics of those here in just a minute. But if we start having this chronic stress response where we're always going through this perceived threat, remember? So it's in your brain. Your brain isn't seeing out. Your brain's literally in the dark. And so it's only getting the signals you're sending it, whether that signal is coming from your eyes when you see the predator, or this is coming from your thoughts when you are thinking about what's going to happen at work. I got to make this deadline. What's going on with my wife? What's going on with my kids? What's going on with the economy? What's going on with my retirement account? What's going on in politics? What's happening on the news? You could be constantly telling your hypothalamus, this part of your brain, hey, there's a threat. And so as long as there is a perceived threat, real or imaginary, we're going to start to kick this cortisol process on. So if we keep that thing on and if we just talk about blood sugar levels, so if we just keep going through that gluconeogenesis process and breaking down of stored glycogen and keeping those blood sugar levels really high, what we're going to start to see is your insulin levels increase with it. Now, I made a video on insulin resistance before, and I'll post that here. I'll put that link to it. So if you want to check that out, maybe after this video, then go see like some of the real dangers of insulin resistance. But what's going to happen is those blood glucose levels are going to circulate for a long time. Your insulin levels are going to come up, and now your body's becoming really insulin resistant. Now, naturally, cortisol in the blood creates an insulin resistant situation because, like I said, your body is trying to keep the rest of your organs, with the exception of your brain, from burning up that glucose like they normally would. All organs are going to prefer glucose as an energy source in a normal situation. But when the cortisol levels are high, your body pushes for insulin resistance to keep the rest of your organs from using that sugar, so your brain gets first shot at it. So those insulin levels stay high, our insulin resistance levels stay high, or we start to create insulin resistance in the cells, and now that process isn't working well. And so, like I said, again, go watch that video, see what that could be doing to you. But I mentioned earlier that your organs will start to, particularly your skeletal muscle, will start to prefer burning fat, and that sounds good. The problem is when we stay in this state for such a long time and that insulin resistance does get high, we actually start to store fat, because when those muscles and everything start to try to use fat, your body's actually going through a process of breaking fat down from stored fat. So it's releasing triglycerides, which is the typical storage form of fat. It's releasing that into your blood. But when those insulin levels push up, remember, insulin is a storage chemical, it's anabolic, it starts to store that fat. Unfortunately, it starts to redistribute where that fat is stored, and it's going to start to prefer visceral fat. Now, got another video here. Check that out, the dangers of visceral fat, why you really don't want that and what that's doing to your health long term. So now we're in this state, we're starting to increase belly fat. Additionally, our brain is still using this glucose. So you're in this state, you think if there's a real threat, there's something happening, your mind races. It almost seems like time slows down because your decision making becomes really, really acute. This thinking process is fast. Additionally, when that cortisol was released, there was adrenaline released with it. So everything gets heightened for you to be able to fight or flee. Well, that state chronically is incredibly exhausting and is going to lead to things like anxiety, where your mind is always racing because you're always getting this cortisol, you're getting this adrenaline, and additionally your brain is being constantly fed because it's being sensitized to this glucose that's being made available for it by keeping those blood glucose levels high in your blood. So what else will start to happen? Well, I told you that the protein synthesis will slow down and your body will start breaking down those amino acids to start using as fuel, as well as sending them to the liver to start creating that sugar through gluconeogenesis. So if that process is going on, you're not building muscle and you're regularly breaking it down, well, now we're looking at muscle loss and strength loss. So you will start to, the term for this when we have wasting muscle is sarcopenia. We typically see this in older adults, but this is just, your muscle is just being destroyed really gradually. So people that have really high sustained cortisol levels will typically start to see things like muscle loss in the thighs and buttocks, which is going to be your biggest muscle groups. And that can be measured. We'll see that, people start to lose strength and muscle mass in that area. Particularly, they're losing it everywhere, but that's just where you're going to see the biggest changes because that's where you probably had the most muscle mass to begin with. So that's something you have to look forward to if you keep your stress hormones high, is skinny legs and a flat butt. That's not great. So what else is going to happen if we keep those levels high? Well, you can't really typically have hormones that do the opposite thing working at the same time. So if I tell you that cortisol is catabolic, and we've said that testosterone is anabolic, that axis doesn't really operate at the same time. There's a little bit of exception to that. It does seem that both levels increase slightly. Testosterone actually increases a little bit more during exercise. It's almost statistically insignificant, the level that cortisol levels rise during an exercise. But if we look at it from a pharmaceutical standpoint, where you take cortisol and you inject that into somebody who's at rest, nothing else is going on, their testosterone levels will fall. So those levels are not going to stay elevated at the same time. So if you have high cortisol levels, chronically high cortisol levels, your testosterone levels are going to be suppressed. Because, like we said, if you need to be breaking muscle down to be turning that into sugar to give to your brain to process during this fight or flight situation, well, we can't also have a hormone that's building the muscle and trying to assimilate amino acids. It wouldn't work. That's your body using a lot of energy for two processes that cancel out. And your body is almost never going to do that. Your body is always trying to conserve energy. It's trying to think of what can I turn off to save as much energy as possible. So it's very rarely going to run two processes that counteract. It's going to downregulate one to get the effect. And so that might be cortisol level goes up, testosterone goes down, because we can kind of stop this progression. Additionally, like I said, these are both steroid hormones, meaning they are made largely out of the same stuff. So if you're making a bunch of cortisol, you don't necessarily have all the building blocks to make your testosterone. So that's another thing we're going to see with heightened cortisol levels over a long period of time. So what might be causing high cortisol levels? I mentioned a few environmental things like your relationships, your job, the news, the economy, whatever. anything that you're perceiving as a threat to your livelihood, your well-being, your family, all of those things can increase those cortisol levels because, again, it is the stress hormone. But there are some other things that, you might be rocking along thinking everything's going pretty good, but there maybe are some other behavioral things that you're doing that you don't realize that are affecting your hormone levels. So one of which is going to be a low protein diet. Your body will respond to low levels of leucine in the blood, which is an amino acid, and we'll just say interchangeably, we'll use that as protein right now. So if those leucine levels are low because you're not eating enough protein, your body's going to respond to that in somewhat of a starvation sort of scenario where it's going to increase the stress on your body, which means the cortisol levels are going to increase. All right, so a low protein diet, magnesium deficiency. So if you're low on magnesium, magnesium can actually kind of protect. When I talked about that process of the hypothalamus sending a signal to the pituitary, sending all of that, the ACTH out and that going to your adrenal glands, magnesium can actually protect that receptor in the brain from some of this response. So maybe there's some stress where magnesium will kind of play goalie and say, hey, we're not going to let all that signal through. Maybe we'll reduce, we'll excrete a little bit of this stuff that's going to end up being cortisol, but we're not going to excrete as much as maybe we normally would. Now, if your magnesium levels are low, it doesn't protect that NMDA receptor in the brain. And so it allows that this is very basic. Some people probably might be upset with me that I'm saying it this way, but it's really reducing, it's not letting the full signal get through. And it's, again, much more complex than that, but you're really pulling out all the stops if the magnesium isn't there to kind of slow down that signal a little bit. Additionally, gut inflammation. So if you're eating a lot of grain, for instance, or you're drinking a lot of alcohol, you are really disrupting your microbiome. Additionally, you're disrupting this kind of mucus barrier inside of your intestines that keeps the stuff in your intestines from getting into your blood, which actually does happen and creates a state of something called endotoxemia. There's lipopolysaccharides that are being released from your food and this bad bacteria in your stomach, and it's getting out everywhere. It's getting into your blood, it's getting into your joints and your skin, all this stuff. But what you really need to know is if that gut inflammation is going on, and it doesn't mean you're in extreme pain, it doesn't mean you're having horrible diarrhea or throwing up. It could be this chronic level of inflammation all the time that you've just gotten accustomed to. A little bit of bloating, whatever, you just think that's normal. It isn't. But that level of inflammation is also exerting stress on your body, which is bumping these cortisol levels up. It's constantly keeping you in the state of stress. Visceral fat. Visceral fat is going to produce a handful of things in the body that are creating stressors, but one of them are these different interleukins. These are kind of inflammatory chemicals that are being excreted particularly by visceral fat. So it's coming out of all fat cells, but particularly that belly fat around the organs, like we've talked about in videos past. And one of the most intense things you can do to negatively impact your health as far as cortisol levels, meaning one of the things you can do to jack those cortisol levels up the most is not sleeping. And I don't mean totally abstaining from sleep. I mean partial sleep. If you're not getting enough sleep, you are really increasing your cortisol levels, something like 30 to 50% over a couple of nights. But remember, if we push those cortisol levels up that much, that means blood glucose is going up, circulating fat triglycerides are going up, which means that's also increasing your cholesterol levels. If you are in a high cortisol state and you get your blood tested, all those circulating triglycerides, that stuff is staying in your blood. So those levels are going to be high. Your blood glucose is going to be high. And it's going to be sustained just by this not sleeping because your brain, again, thinks, look, if we can't sleep, there must be something going on around us that we need to be aware of because something is necessitating us being awake. Maybe the tribe next to us has been infiltrating the camp at night or whatever. There's a predator out there that we need to be aware of, but we're not in a secure space. So we need to keep our that alertness level high. We need to keep that blood glucose in the brain so we can make these decisions. We need to keep that adrenaline high in case we've got to jump up out of the bed and run or fight in the middle of the night. Your brain doesn't know that you're not sleeping because you're on Instagram all night or because the TV's on or you just have bad sleep hygiene. It doesn't know that. It just knows that you are awake. We need to keep these cortisol levels high because why in the world would you be awake when the sun's down and there's no work to be done and you can't hunt? So we haven't caught up to this modern world. Your brain hadn't caught up to this modern world. So it just perceives, hey, awake at 2 a.m., jack those cortisol levels up because something must be going on. All right. Now, particularly missing sleep in the second part of your sleep, so that early morning sleep for some reason seems to increase those cortisol levels higher. Not exactly sure why that is, although we do know that cortisol is it's on a diurnal basis, meaning that it's being excreted throughout the day at different levels. One of your lowest levels is going to be about 2 a.m. and your highest level is going to be around 8 a.m. So right when you're waking up, that's the highest point of cortisol level throughout your day, which kind of makes sense if, the assumption is you've been fasted overnight, you haven't eaten, you get this hit of cortisol first thing in the morning, which increases those blood glucose levels, which allows your brain to run off whatever, because in the past you might not have had a lot of glucose to access. So we get those blood glucose levels high so your brain can kind of become alert first thing in the morning, even though you haven't eaten. We've changed a lot of that process for people now, but that's still the way it goes. Now, one big sign that you might have high cortisol levels is if you are you've messed this cycle up and you are waking up in the middle of the night, maybe 2, 3 a.m., and you can't go back to sleep. You wake up and your brain starts to race, right? And then you have a hard time going back to sleep until maybe 8 a.m. Well, that is that cortisol, that diurnal system being flipped. So you can kind of see where it should be low at 2, it should be high at 8. Now you've got your levels really high at 2 a.m. So it kicks on. That signal says, hey, something's going on. You need to be really susceptible to this blood sugar right now. We're going to keep those levels high for you. So you wake up, that adrenaline's kicked up a little bit too, and then you just start processing. And it's, what do I have to do at work tomorrow? What's going on with this? All this stuff starts to process real quick and you can't rest, which is going to lead to that lack of sleep. And then this is going to be a kind of a continual issue. So it's something you really got to get a hold of. So it's just some stuff that I haven't, I'm going to go through a list here. It's definitely not totally inclusive, but a list of consequences you might see of elevated stress and elevated cortisol levels over time. So weight gain, high blood pressure, fatigue, changes in mood, irritability, flush face, thinning skin, difficulty concentrating, and insulin resistance. And I want to take this a little bit further and give you an idea. There's a good way that we can kind of measure what happens with prolonged exposure to high levels of cortisol because of the use of corticosteroids for chronic disease. So using something like prednisone for a person that has lupus or rheumatoid arthritis, they're using this corticosteroid. Remember, cortisol is a corticosteroid. They're using this long-term to help the negative impact of some sort of disease. Usually this is going to be, really intense inflammation caused by, again, the lupus, the RA, whatever, some autoimmune disease. Side effects of prednisone over the long term are going to be weight gain, redistribution of fat. This is a stated side effect of using long-term corticosteroids, not just weight gain, but redistribution of fat, particularly to the stomach, increase in visceral fat, strength loss, muscle loss. And I can tell you from my experience in the OR, I saw a lot of people, unfortunately, incredibly sad, people that have had RA for quite a while and have been on prednisone for a long time. Their joints start, not just joints from, obviously from the inflammation, but long-term impact of prednisone can actually destroy the larger joints, like your hip joints and your knees. So long exposure to prednisone, these people are already dealing with joint pain, particularly in their hands and their fingers. And that RA, it does become systemic. It goes everywhere. But it was actually a lot of the steroids that would start leading to breaking bones, destruction of other joints, exclusive of the RA. And then additionally, just total degradation of the organs over time. Because remember, corticosteroids are catabolic. They're breaking down to create energy for the brain, and it's flipping what your body should really be using. I've said in videos past that the most insulin sensitizing organ in your body is your muscles, because they burn up the most glucose. But if this cortisol is telling those muscles, don't use glucose, use fatty acids if you have to, but at best, don't use anything. Just use the fatty acids, but let the brain have the sugar. And so it's really, it's breaking all that stuff down. So that's one way we can really see what is the exposure of long-term cortisol is through the effects of prednisone. Additionally, if you've ever been around somebody or you've ever taken prednisone, you might have taken it short-term for an injury, or you had a respiratory infection or whatever. You know how it affects your brain, the irritability, really quick changes in mood. It makes you a little bit manic. Well, it's putting you in a fight or flight response all the time. So what are some ways that we can reduce this stress? What can we do to kind of back this off? Well, obviously, some of the really clear ones, number one thing you could do right off the bat, fix your sleep cycle. Try to go to sleep at the same time every day. Try to wake up at the same time every day. Get your sleep hygiene good. The phone is off an hour before you go to bed. Try not to sleep with the TV on. Turn the lights off. You want the room cool and dark and quiet. So really try to get that sleep. If you wake up in the middle of the night, try to figure out how to go back to bed. Don't get up and start processing, doing all this. Learn some, maybe even meditation or some mind clearing techniques to help you get back to sleep, because that sleep is so important. Improving your diet, dropping the grain out of your diet, drinking less to improve your gut inflammation, to get your gut back healthy again, so that stuff isn't getting secreted out in your blood and creating that constant low level of inflammation that's increasing those cortisol levels. Eat enough protein. We know that low levels of leucine in the diet lead to this higher level of cortisol, so make sure you're getting enough protein, and predominantly animal protein, because B vitamins are shown to reduce cortisol levels, and B vitamins are going to be present in meat. This is something that vegetarians and vegans often struggle with, is getting enough B vitamins, because they're mainly present in meat, particularly organ meats. So, eat some meat, eat some beef liver, get those B vitamin levels high. Make sure you're eating enough magnesium. This has generally kind of maybe a good way to put it is like a soothing effect over the entire body. This can reduce like muscle cramping. It can lower blood pressure, but also, again, protecting that NMDA receptor in the brain. So get some magnesium in your food. You might get this from pumpkin seeds, leafy green vegetables. Dark chocolate is a great source of magnesium. A lot of nuts are a good source of magnesium. So keep those magnesium levels high. And that just generally is going to help some other things. Like I said, blood pressure, for instance, because this kind of works on the opposite side of sodium to keep some, the osmotic pressure kind of good in your cells and your blood. Try to regulate your blood sugar as much as you can, because that fluctuation in blood sugar, is already going to take place with that high level of cortisol. So we want to keep that as low as possible, which is going to mean reducing your sugar intake. Again, reducing your grain intake. That amylopectin A in grain is going to shoot your blood sugar through the roof. And reducing alcohol, again, is going to be a good way to reduce that blood sugar. And caffeine. Caffeine in itself can really increase your cortisol levels. It seems like maybe over time your body gets used to it and the cortisol response isn't as significant, but it still has some sort of impact, which really creates some interesting implications for people using, and I'm guilty of it, but using pre-workouts that have high levels of caffeine in them. If we're not clearing those cortisol levels high enough, then that really will affect your recovery long-term, remembering that this cortisol is reducing that protein synthesis and it's breaking down amino acids. So, maybe that needs to be a whole video in itself. Could the caffeine in a pre-workout be counterproductive? Additionally, besides just the diet stuff, try to reduce the stressors in your life. And that sounds so obvious and kind of useless information, but think about, there's a lot of stressors in life we can't just get rid of. If you're having troubles with your wife, I'm not telling you to just be like, hey, I'm out. Hey, this guy on the internet said that I need to reduce my stressors and you are stressing me out, so I'm gone. Don't do that. But there are stressors that you're probably putting on yourself right now that you could get rid of. Turn the news off if that stresses you out. You can't let your finances totally go. Obviously, if you're stressed about, what your retirement's doing right now, you can't just drop that, but maybe you don't need to check it every 5 minutes. It's probably not going to change that much. Put yourself on a schedule. When can I check these things? When can I get in touch with these things that really stress me out? Are you the type of person that gets on social media and argues with people in the comments? Your brain is perceiving that as a threat. I would say stop that entirely, but limit yourself to how much you are engaging in those stressful situations, because over time, you are looking at some really serious side effects from keeping those cortisol levels high. Additionally, try implementing, could be meditation, could be yoga. These are things that are obviously shown to reduce cortisol levels and stress levels. Get on an exercise plan. There is just mountains of data to show that if you're getting the recommended amount of exercise, at least 30 minutes of moderate activity 5 days a week, I would encourage more. But if you're getting that will help reduce cortisol levels. Go for a walk out in the woods. This helps. Being in nature, clinically proven to reduce cortisol levels, because things maybe seem a little bit simpler. You can clear your mind a little bit. And additionally, if you followed some of my social media, I've been doing a lot of this recently. Work outside. Cut the grass. Clear the yard. Paint something. Do something physical that you immediately see the fruits of your labor. If you cut the grass, if you're one of those people, I like it, or vacuum or dust, something like that. If you're one of those people that, when you cut the grass, you like looking over at the side that you just cut and then seeing what's coming next. And when that, that new strip goes over and it's all even and everything, that gives you kind of a, it's a calming, it's a satisfying feeling. That's what's going on. You're reducing your cortisol levels. You're increasing your dopamine and serotonin levels. You're increasing the sense of satisfaction because you're seeing your labor being productive right there in the moment. So try to find things that do that. That will help reduce this cortisol level, get you to a healthier state. And then I don't know if you have some other type of way that you reduce stress, comment, let me know. We can't have enough of them, I don't think. In a world that's so stressed out, the more, ways to reduce stress, the better. So if you've hung in with me, wow, over 30 minutes now, I really appreciate it. If you find this information, the stuff I'm doing valuable, please like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you would like to hear. Share this information. If you know that somebody's really stressed out and, I don't know, we don't want to stress them out more by letting them know, hey, your stress is maybe killing you, or it's making you fat and making you lose muscle. But maybe the parts where they could see, here's some things you can do about it. And, seeing what it can really do to you might help people make their stressful situation, they might take it more seriously and know that this is not just everybody deals with it. Yeah, but here's why we need to be dealing with it and how can we deal with it more effectively. So again, thank you for being with me. And hope to see you again next time.